Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. We are going to replace this computer's motherboard, RAM, and processor. Why are we doing this? Well, this computer seems to run really good, but the problem is that at times it doesn't run so good. And the reason is that this computer's motherboard has actually been damaged with water. There was also a graphics card in here that had sparked and started smoking. And so between that water damage and then the sparks from the graphics card, this computer really just needs a new motherboard. When you go to replace a motherboard, unless you get the exact same one or one that fits the correct sockets of your processor, you'll also need a new processor. And depending on the specs of your motherboard and what your processor allows, you sometimes need new RAM. So I went ahead and got all three just to be better safe than sorry, and instead of trying to mix and match some of the stuff that's already here, I wanted to get all new. That's going to help the computer run a lot better, especially with the solid state drive and the M.2 drives that are in this computer here. So some of the things that you're going to need besides just the parts is thermal paste. You need that anytime you're working with a processor. You need a good set of screwdrivers. And if you are reusing a processor or a heatsink or a liquid cooling piece that was connected to your old processor, you'll need some rubbing alcohol, Q-tips, and something to wipe that down with. Now, some other things to watch out for is you need to make sure that before you start messing with any computer internals, whether they're new parts or something that's already in there, you need to make sure you're grounded. They make mats for that. But and you can also, I typically just kind of make sure that when I touch metal that I'm already grounded before I touch something else to make sure there's no electrical spark there or electromagnetivity. Other thing is, I suggest if you have a metal ring, take it off. Even if you have a silicone ring, anytime I'm doing work like this, I always suggest just taking it off. That way you don't catch it on something and snag or break apart. So the other thing is that while you've got your computer open, might as well take some time to wipe down some internal parts. This thing was pretty gross. I went ahead and wiped it down a little bit. It's not perfect. It needs a good deep clean. So depending on how much time you want to put into this, if you want, you can take every part out of the computer, wipe them all down, do not use water, and use something alcohol based, and then put it all back together. For what we're doing here today, I'm not going to wipe everything down and take it all out and replace and put it all back in. I'm just going to take out what I need to take out in order to get these new parts in. So I'm going to go ahead and get this thing opened up. There's usually screws on the back here, and you get those screws out. Set this aside. Don't need that anytime soon. You might have seen some of the dust come off that. It's pretty gross. You also want to remove the back side of the case because you'll need to be able to access both sides, so that way you can make sure all the wiring that's back here, if your case allows for wiring kind of back on the back side of the motherboard, you can make sure that everything is 1, cleaned, 2, organized, and ready to go. Plus, most heat sinks will actually, and processors, you'll have to go through the back to make sure that everything is properly connected and disconnected in our case. So next, just lay this down. I would suggest taking pictures of how everything's connected before you start pulling everything apart, just to be safe. That way you know what goes where if you're using the same motherboard. If you're using a different motherboard, it still gives you a good idea of what to look for on where things go. So before I remove anything else, I'm going to make sure that this liquid cooling system works with this motherboard. I've already done research on it, and it should work pretty well without any issues. Typically, most of these hookups will work with the same brand of processors. So if you're using, a 10th gen Intel processor and you go to an 11th gen Intel processor, typically your heat sinks will still match up. Now, if you're using a 1st gen Intel and going to a brand new AMD, that's not going to work. or first gen to 11th gen. Those don't always match up, but for the most part, they will. So we've got this loose. Now I just got to take the fan off, or fan plug off right here. And this, as you saw, I really didn't have to do a whole lot. There is thermal paste on this heatsink, but it didn't bond very well because all I did was pull the screws off, and after I got the top two completely off and loosened, it started to lift off the processor. Whenever you do this, you got to make sure that you use enough thermal paste. The other thing is traditionally when you're taking this off, you need to do a little wiggle. Make sure that as you're pulling the processor off, or as you're pulling this off the processor, you wiggle it. That'll help break it loose. If you just yank on it, you run the risk of damaging your processor because you can rip the processor out of its sockets, and that's not a good thing. So definitely take some care when messing with this. So I'm going to take a moment here and open up all my parts and lay them out. Alright, so I took everything out. I left the motherboard in this bag here that helps prevent any damage from electricity. I have the processor still in its plastic case here. Better safe than sorry. Again, with the RAM also in its plastic case, I'll pull those out when I need them. Right now I do need the motherboard. So I'm going to take it out of its bag. Very, very careful the whole time you're messing with the motherboard. Anytime you mess with internal parts, you need to be careful. But motherboards, processor, RAMs, be extremely cautious. Tell here I got my little buddy helping out. No, he wants to help out a little too much sometimes. Good boy. And so now, to make sure that this matches, be very careful again. It's going to match up. Another thing you can do is also check it out on the back. And it works just fine. So that's great. Like I said, I already did my research on it, already knew that it was going to match up, but it doesn't hurt to double check before you completely disassemble everything and then go, well, I'm screwed, I gotta wait for a new fan, or liquid cooler, or heatsink. So I'm gonna go ahead and start disconnecting everything in here. I'm gonna move you closer so you can see it and watch me while I do it. Not really gonna talk, I'm gonna just have a time lapse going here. So now you see me disconnect everything. You probably saw me tape this up. I did that just so that way it's easier for me to put them back together, or put them in the correct spot on the next motherboard, because those are actually 4 different cables there, or I guess technically 8. Yeah. And so then I had to take the whole heatsink off here. You could tell like the fan and intercooler, it was pretty gross. And sorry I called that a heatsink. It's not. It's intercooler and a fan for the liquid cooling for the processor. So what's left here is we got the RAM. I'm not reusing this RAM. It is compatible with my new motherboard. However, it is not compatible with my new processor because the speed is not high enough for that new processor. Here's the old processor. I'm going to leave it right there, and I'll deal with that later on. Now, to continue removing the motherboard, we've got several screws. Now, the screw placements will depend on your motherboard, but also depend on your case. This case fits an ATX form factor of the motherboard. There are tons of different form factors out there, so just pay attention to which one you buy. Now, we're going to go ahead and get the new processor mounted to the motherboard. Some people will do the motherboard first and then like put it in the case and then put your processor on. Others will put the processor on and then put the motherboard in the case. All right, so I can't stress this enough. You have to be extremely careful. We're going to go ahead and open this up and get this here flipped up. Okay, so now we can put the processor on all of its pins. Now we have the processor. You see all of its little pins and everything in there. So we're gonna just set this nice and easy. Now, one of the things you have to be very careful of when you're purchasing a motherboard or a processor, these two have to be compatible. If they are not compatible, this will not work. Your processor will not work with it. Can't stress that enough. So, got that. The manufacturer says to go ahead and install the processor before taking this off, this cap off here. So it even tells you on there, sorry about not focusing very well, install processor first, then remove and keep this cover. So that's something to take into consideration. We've got the motherboard, or the processor sitting in the motherboard. So now it's time to go ahead and get the thermal paste ready. Now the thermal paste can be extremely messy, so you got to be extremely careful when applying this. You got to be very patient. It does have instructions usually with your case. It'll tell you how to apply it. I have seen thermal paste that you have to mix. I've seen some where you don't. So we're just going to go ahead and open this little guy up here. And get this ready. Okay, so there it is. It's ready to go. But before we apply it, this motherboard needs to go inside of its case. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we have to cautiously put the motherboard into its case. You got to be very careful. The problem with leaving all these wires in like I did is that you got a lot of crap in your way, so that makes your job that much more difficult. But if you are very cautious, it's not too terribly bad. So I'm going to try to line up a couple of these holes here. And then the other thing is, got to make sure this back goes in properly, which that was extremely simple, as you could tell. I put the back into place back here, and the rest of the motherboard just fell into place. Now, very important, you got to put those screws back into the motherboard. As you can tell, I kind of put these around the edges of the board. Some motherboards will come with screws, some won't. This one didn't, at least none that I could find in the box, which I was surprised about. There's also cases that come with screws and some that don't. However, you'll notice there's extra spots where a screw could have gone. That is sometimes 4 extra screws. I've seen motherboards with 8 screws in them. I've seen motherboards with 3 screws in them. I went ahead and used all 4 of mine, and I put them in the 4 corners. I'm going to go ahead and start putting these back into place. I'm also going to have to refer back to my pictures that I took beforehand just to make sure. Now, there's a few stickers here that need to come off, or actually one that I see that needs to come off, and that's this little guy here telling you how to install an M2 on these 2 spots. And then this sticker here actually stays, so just beware, you will have to take some off and leave some on. But again, we're going to go into another time lapse here, and I'm going to put all the cables back on. All right, so that wasn't too bad. There's a few things that I still have left to do, and I'm going to kind of talk through those. First off, you'll see I have an extra SATA cable here. That's part of why I've got this PCIe card. Now, you'll see that I've got 3 PCIe 1s, and then I've got a couple 16s. And so this needs I believe it's a 4, PCIe 4. So since it's too big for those, it's going to have to go with one of these 2 bigger ones. So I'm actually going to put it on this one here. Now, I had an extra card on the last motherboard here. I'm going to go ahead and put this in. I like to have 2. I use this thing as a server, so it's kind of nice to have a couple of different network cards on it. Now, I could put it in any one of these PCIe 1 slots, but I'm going to go ahead and drop it in this one here. And then the next thing here, you'll see I have 2 open slots. That's for this one and this graphics card, which this graphics card isn't that great these days. Back in the time, in its prime, it was alright. But this one here I'm actually going to place in this big slot. You got to push that down. That way, there's a little hook here that's got to set in there. So make sure that it slides in. You hear it click. That popped that back up. That hook did. And so now I need to put the screw in place for it. And right here, I've got an extra one of these. Got this M.2 M key card, and I say M key because of this slot right here. B key would also have a slot over here. Alright, so with this motherboard, typically, like I said, you've got these 3 spots here for different size M2 slot or M2 SSDs. Normally what happens is you have a little post here, which you can see, and then there's a screw. You slide this in, there's a screw that goes in right here on the post that locks in right there, and it keeps this back end down. Well, this motherboard here is a little bit different. It has this little clip here that when you put this in, very carefully, just kind of slide it in. I'm going to lower it, and as you lower it, you spin this around, and that clip holds it into place, so that way it makes it easy to install and uninstall. I like that, I really do, because trying to fight with a small little screw, as you've seen with some of these screws, I've kind of dropped them. They're just kind of hard to get your fingers around sometimes. So that's actually a really good, pleasant idea for them to have. So now we need to install the heatsink back on, and this thing is this motherboard. I can't get over how nice it is. It's got these heat sinks, this heat sink, these heat sinks. So to help keep this nice and cool, take that off. There's a little adhesive there, and that's going to stick on here to help make sure that this thing stays nice and cool. So that's on there, nice and secure. You don't want to over tighten, and that's something that I should have told you earlier when putting your screws in the motherboard. You never want to over tighten. When it comes to any of this stuff, you want to make sure it's snug, but you don't want to just crank down on it because you don't want to break anything. So next step, I need my new RAM. When installing your RAM, you want to make sure that your notches line up, so that way they're installed correctly. So make sure that you pop these open and slide them in. Then this will pop back into place whenever the RAM is securely placed in there. So we're going to do the same thing with this one. We're going to put it in the 3rd slot here. I usually do 1 and 3, and then do 2 and 4 last. If I've had two more RAM sticks, put those in there. And so, as long as I didn't forget a cable, which is a very good possibility when you got all these in there, that's one good reason why it's nice to pull everything out, because then you see everything that you've got, so when you go to put everything back, you can pretty much guarantee that you've got everything in place. And so when you don't take everything out, you've got a whole mess in here, you know, rat's nest. You've got to make sure that you got everything in place and it gets lost, and yeah. So I did find a little guy down here. Now I'm gonna have to rotate this and actually see. So I can read on here and it'll tell me, you know, these are fans and USB plugs. Let's see here. Sometimes it helps to look at the other motherboard so you can see exactly what you got down in there. Found where this needs to go, this little mess here. I don't typically like putting tape on things, especially computer parts, but these little guys are a pain if you lose track of what's what and where they go exactly. So now that these little guys are good to go, the last thing I got to do is install this nice little cooling agent. But before we can do that, I've got all of this gunk that we've got to wipe off here. So let's go ahead and get that cleaned up. As you can tell, this fan is actually pretty disgusting, so I should clean it. So I'm using rubbing alcohol. That's really what you should use. Some people will say use a microfiber cloth first, but I just prefer to go directly with the good stuff. And as you can tell, it's looking good, getting all clean. And the processor is brand new, so it doesn't have to be cleaned off like this. So we'll just go ahead and dry this off here. I'm going to let it rest for a moment. And this fan is pretty gross down in here. I'm actually going to go ahead and take it apart and clean it real quick. So I went and got a wipe here to clean this off. Now you want to be careful with your fans. You never want to just get them spinning when you're cleaning or blowing them out with air. It's never a good thing. And the reason is that you can damage the motor. You know, they've got a little play in them, and that's okay. Whoops, see, like that there, that was a bad thing. I shouldn't have done that. But yes, that's something you want to try to avoid, is getting these things spinning when they're not supposed to be. You don't want to damage the motor inside of them. Another thing is you want to make sure that you get your fans put on correctly so you have the right air blowing the right direction. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and put this cooler back in. Wiped it down, but as you can tell, it's still a little gross. These things are hard to clean if you don't clean them often, so I'm going to go ahead and start by putting this back in, connecting the intercooler to the housing or the case. So now we need to put the fan in, and there's usually a spot that says CPU fan. And there's two spots for a CPU fan. So make sure you put it in the first slot if there's two. That way it actually runs like it's supposed to. So now we got extra cable here we got to just kind of tuck in. Okay, so now got the heatsink all cleaned up and dried. Got the processor ready to go. Let's make sure there's nothing on it there. And it's time to install the thermal paste that we opened up earlier and got ready so we could just grab and go. Right, so there's two options here. You can apply it to the the bottom side of the fan here or a heat sink. The other thing is you can apply directly to the processor. I always say the processor because, as you can tell, there's a lot more surface area here than down there. And so if you put it on this, you're just going to make a mess. It's not a good idea. So very carefully put a little bit on there. Right. Now, got to get this guy in here. Something that I forgot to mention was this little guy. I had to pull off the back of the other motherboard, and it goes on the back of this one, and that's what helps hold the heat. Look, the heat sink kind of screw into and hold it into place for this liquid cooling system. Alright, so as I lay this thing back down, being very careful, as you can tell, it's not disconnected from the motherboard or the processor. Got the heatsink all attached and ready to go. So everything is connected properly. Got things mostly cleaned out. Everything's wiped down. Got all the new stuff properly installed and ready to go. So next thing that we have to do is flip this up, put the back of the case back on, and then we'll put the front of the case back on. And then we're going to fire it up. Alright, so we've got to get the back of this case on here. And so whenever I was getting ready to put the back on, I noticed I had an extra cable just kind of sticking out back here that needed to be plugged in. So I went ahead and plugged that in. And when I did that, I found one fan that wasn't plugged in for the processor. This actually has two fans, one here, one there, essentially kind of moving things around. And so I had to get those plugged in as well, which I was missing one of these, and then like I said, another one back here. So now that we're ready to go, we can get this mess of cables kind of organized the best we can back here. As you can see, it's kind of a rat's nest there. So set the phone back there with the resting kitty cat. A lot of this kind of tuckered the little guy out. So before I put the front of this case on, I'm actually going to go power up this computer, make sure that it turns on and that everything works before I put the cover on, because I don't want to put it all 100% back together and something not work. So we're going to go ahead and get this powered up. Alright, so I've got a temporary setup here with the open case computer. Got a monitor here plugged into the HDMI port. So we're going to just see if this thing fires up. Oh. Got to turn the power switch on first. And it's on. Shows my solid state drive through the M2. Got my other solid state drive. Got my spinning drives, which there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's 1, 2, 3. Yep. So all those are all there. New CPU installed, all that good stuff. Gotta hit enter and start configuring my system. So I'm not going to bore you with all this information, all your BIOS information from your motherboard. You'll be able to navigate on your own. Every BIOS is a little bit different. The user face is a little bit different. Older BIOS, you have to use a lot of the keyboard and mouse keyboards rather than the mouse. So I'm not going to bore you with all this because it doesn't pertain to you unless you have the exact same motherboard. But I would suggest getting to know this interface before you start making major adjustments to your computer, like turbocharging your processor by chance. So, but the awesome thing is that newer motherboards, they do give you a lot more data. They'll tell you, Windows Boot Manager on the correct hard drive here, so that's great. So I'm just going to leave everything at default, not change anything. I'll get back in here later to tweak things, but I am seeing that my all my information is correct up here. So we're just gonna shoot for giving this a shot. We're gonna save and exit, and no changes were made. That is correct. So the computer's going to reboot, and hopefully Windows 10 will show up, and then at some point I'll put Windows 11 on this. Alright, so Windows pulled up just fine. The background is the screen's kind of hard to see. The background's all snowy, so it's going to come across white in the video feed. But Windows is working just fine here. So now it's time to take this thing back out, put a cover on, and kind of tighten up or clean up some of these wires here that are trying to hit fans. So everyone, I think we have the kitty's approval. He is going through and making sure that everything is good to go. We good to go, bud? Are we good to go? Yeah, I think so. All right, so now that the computer turns on, last thing I'm going to do is take some zip ties here, and we're going to clean up a little bit of this cable mess here. We got everything pretty much tucked away the best it's going to be. Kind of not the prettiest wiring job, and some of that is because I've got a traditional power supply unit instead of a modular one. The modular one would actually allow you to kind of pick and choose which of these you need and which you don't, and unfortunately, as you saw on the back side of the case here, there's a lot of cables that I don't need. So it's kind of hard to make it look good with that. And also with all these hard drives in here, you got SATA cables running all over. Next thing we got to do, put this on. Promise I did wipe that down, just, not always the cleanest job. So I want to make sure that these last few fans are plugged in correctly. And so there we go. You've got everything in there. You've got your case put together. You've got all your parts in there, making sure they're working already. So, if you've never replaced a motherboard or a processor before, it can be a little nerve-wracking because they're expensive parts. You got to be extremely careful. But if you just take your time, double check everything that you're about to do before you do it. Make sure you've got an order of how you want things done, and you should be good to go. Just be careful and don't forget anything. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe.